And then here is a chart where I label all the different corporations so we can compare them all. And so realize there's mainly three things we're going to look at. We're never going to want to do a sole proprietor, and we're never want to do a partnership. And the reason why is because for both of those, they have unlimited liability. And our goal is to use the corporations to basically shield us from liability so that if we have other assets that we own, those are not at risk just because we're trying a company, right? So you're going to be using one of three of these types of companies. And the important thing to realize is that basically for the formation of an LLC, it starts by filing a thing called the Articles of Organization. And then for a C Corp, you basically will also file Articles of Incorporation. So it's a little bit different. One's Articles of Organization, one's Articles of Incorporation. And then for the S Corp, you actually start it as a C Corp. Then you file this special form called 2553. You can just look it up, like do a Google search, S Corp form, IRS. You can always look it up anytime. But basically you file this form with the IRS. They send you a little letter back saying, hey, we approved it. You're S elected. And that allows you to have that advantage of not having to do essentially double taxation. The ownership of the different companies, obviously different. Limited liability company, the LLC, is owned by the members. Versus a C Corp, kind of like, remember the big companies like Apple, IBM, et cetera, those are owned by shareholders. And then the S Corp is kind of this weird hybrid, which is shareholders, but it has to be less than 100 and they all have to be U.S. citizens because the whole point of the S Corp is to basically make it easier on your taxes. So if they're foreign citizens, it wouldn't really help them much. Basically, if you look at the stock that's set up for each of these companies, the LLC doesn't really have any formal stock. It basically has membership interests, and those interests determine where the profits go. However, if you look at a C Corp, think about big companies again, they can have all sorts of classes of stock. They can have preferred stock, non-preferred stock. They have voting shares, non-voting shares. Without getting too much into the weeds, realize that if you're going to build a big company and you're going to have a lot of people involved and people can buy and sell your shares of your company, you're going to be a C Corp. If you have an S Corp, you only have one class of stock, so everybody has to be equal in the S Corp. Which makes sense because S Corps are more designed to be small, and at the max you can only have 100 people in the S Corp anyway, and they'll have to be U.S. citizens. So it wouldn't be a type of company that you'd use to, for example, sell stock and raise money. If you look at the management of the companies, you can see the LLC has members and designated managers. The C Corp has a board of director and officers. It's much more formal. And because of that, if you have a C Corp, you have to go through the formal rigmarole of having board of director meetings, officer titles, etc. With the S Corp, you have a little bit of that, but it's a little bit less. You have board of directors and officers. But with an LLC, you just have members and designated managers. Now, if you look at liability protection across all of them, the LLC has limited liability for members. The C Corp has limited liabilities for shareholders, directors, and officers. And the S Corp has limited liability for shareholders, directors, and officers. So all three of them have great protection on liability, which is the whole purpose of why we would make a company anyway. The next thing is taxation. And this is where it's really important to choose the right type of company. So for the LLC, you have what's called pass-through taxation, where basically you can actually list the profits and losses of the LLC. It passes right through to the person or the members of the company. Obviously with the C Corp, it's not like that. The C Corp has to file its own return. Then it will pay you any dividends or any money that it owes you, and you have to file that on your taxes, which brings up that whole double taxation thing, which is why in general we don't want to use C Corps for small businesses, right? And then if you have the S Corp, which is the most efficient on taxes, which basically allows complete pass-through taxation, which is great. You can also have dividends. What happens is when companies have profits, they can issue these profits in the form of dividends to the owners of the company or shareholders, depending on how it's set up. And so for dividends, for example, it depends on the member's tax rate and how income is distributed, whether it's going to be a salary from the company or a profit. For C Corps, the big companies, just like if you own a stock of, for example, like Exxon or, one of these older companies like a utility, they often will pay dividends. And they'll pay every quarter, they'll pay you some percentage of the profits that the company makes in the form of a dividend. And those are taxed at the shareholder level. So you have to pay tax on your dividends. Even though the company itself has already paid tax on its earnings, you now have to pay tax on the earnings that are sent to you. So there's double taxation there. And then basically the S Corp solves all of that problems because there's no additional tax on dividends as long as you have a reasonable salary that's basically paid. So if you don't have a salary, then maybe a little different. But for most people that work, have their own S Corp, they're going to pay themselves a salary of some kind. And then if the company makes any additional money, they have dividends where they can just simply pass that through and they don't get any additional tax, which is huge. The operating requirements for these companies, as you can see, limited liability is fewer formalities, probably the easiest, I'd say. C Corp is the most complex. You got to have annual meetings, you got to have minutes, etc. And then you have the S Corp, which has a little bit more formalities than the LLC, but a lot fewer than the S Corp, a little easier to do. And then ownership restrictions, basically LLC really doesn't have any kind of ownership restrictions. C Corp, definitely no ownership restrictions. These are the big companies to think of. People from a different country, for example, can buy shares of Apple. There's really no ownership restrictions on that. Now, the S Corp does have ownership restrictions, and that's where you have a limited of 100 shareholders, and they all have to be U.S. citizens or residents, etc. The other thing to remember is how long these companies last, or the duration. So for LLCs, they usually are indefinite, but it depends on the state and depends on how you set it up. For C Corps, they are perpetual, meaning they will continue forever as long as you continue to file all the forms you need to file at the state level. And with the S Corp, same kind of deal. It's perpetual. As long as you keep filing the forms you need to file every year, it will continue forever. So I hope this kind of helped clarify some of the complexities of these companies. Realize that, all these details, I wanted to provide them to you in case you have questions. But for most people, the thing that you're going to probably do is you're probably going to build an S Corp for yourself. If it's something that you're doing, like you want to have a side clinic, you want to have a side hustle, you're probably going to use an S Corp. And the reason why is that it's very simple.